Thank you, Nick. That was lovely and too long. And thank you all for coming. It's a genuine pleasure to be here. I've been here a long time. I forgot how beautiful you have it here. I'm sort of jealous. We just dodged a tornado. I want to add my thanks to all the people and the foundation that Nick thanked. That foundation has bailed me out before for the German Film Institute, which we couldn't have run if they hadn't, in one iteration, if they hadn't come around and helped us out unprompted. So I'm a big fan of the Sunrise Foundation, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share this work with all of you. Thank you for coming. I'll launch right into it with a prologue. In November of 1945, half a year after the Nazi regime, the writer and journalist James Rorty published a short article in the magazine Commentary entitled American Führer in Dress Rehearsal. In it, he warned of, quote, scores of more or less pathological, more or less venal agitators who will try to exploit the market for anti-Semitism created by the economic and social tensions of our post-war adjustment, end of quote. Though these agitators frequently, quote, talk and act like lunatics, says, he insisted that they be, quote, regarded as potentially serious political forces who, given favoring soil and season, might easily grow and flourish disastrously, end quote. Now, the United States had certainly flirted with fascism after the Great Depression and throughout the 1930s. Think Lindbergh and the American First Movement, but think also of the German-American Bund under the leadership of Fritz Kuhn. The point of Sinclair Lewis's 1935 novel, It Can't Happen Here, was, of course, that it could. And yet, it remains jarring to read warnings about pro-Nazi demagoguery in 1945, in full knowledge of the horrors wrought by the Nazi regime in Germany and Eastern Europe. Among the resurgent brass-lunged fundamentalist showmen, that's his wonderful phrase, among the showmen Rorty identified were the likes of Gerald L.K. Smith, erstwhile national organizer for Huey Long, founder of the Christian Nationalist Crusade, and 1944 presidential candidate of the American First Party that he also founded. Joe McWilliams, or Mr. McNazi, as Time magazine called him, a seditionist sympathizer of the German-American Bund, who at one point was supposed to be its leader and the successor to Kuhn when Kuhn went to prison, and who tried to organize and run for a party on the model of the NSDAP. And the serving North Carolina Senator Bob Reynolds, an apologist for the Nazi cause. Since experience teaches us to regard such developments seriously, Rorty concludes, the systematic study of these would-be American Führers is very much in order. You can see where this is going. The systematic study Rorty called for in 1945 remains warranted. While the names of the purveyors of lunatic fringe politics are largely forgotten today, of these, the rise of the new right has spawned forms of demagoguery that arguably harken back to the perilous moment Rorty describes. To be sure, the situation has changed, not least in terms of the media through which such demagoguery can spread. If Rorty's American Führers still largely took to the radio airwaves, today's brass-lunged fundamentalist showmen are largely on YouTube and social media, posting memes and hosting podcasts. This proliferation, however, has been accompanied by a strategic refocusing. Over the intervening decades, a steady stream of far-right thinkers and pundits have recast the lunatic fringe politics that Rorty warned of as something they call metapolitics. And this is the focus of my remarks today. Here's a roadmap. For those who aren't fluent in alt-right newspeak, let me first briefly gloss the notion of metapolitics before I go on to discuss the forms that it takes, the strategies it adopts, and its historical connections with the forms of agitation that Rorty describes. We owe the concept of metapolitics largely to the work of Alain de Benoist, a key thinker of the French Nouvelle Droite, but it may be useful to begin with its pithiest formulation, which comes from Andrew Breitbart. Especially in circles on what was then the alt-right and now on the new right, the founder of Breitbart News is often quoted with the saying that politics is downstream from culture. Metapolitics, accordingly, is what happens upstream from politics in the cultural realm. This realm becomes construed as meta in the sense that it is above, beyond, or even before politics. The German translation sometimes is vorpolitisch, which can be spatial but also temporal. In the patently instrumentalist sense in which Breitbart intended the catchphrase, there is a strategic interest in commandeering cultural positions to realize political gains downriver. This fluvial image condenses and simplifies Benoit's earlier theoretical derivation of metapolitics from the work of the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci and from Benoit's compatriot Louis Althusser, minus the Marxism, of course. Drawing on Gramsci's martial vocabulary of class struggle, Benoit describes metapolitical organizing as a strategy in an all-out war position and a cultural revolution from the right. That's the title of the German book on the right. In a reversal of the classical Marxist assumptions about the secondary importance of culture and ideas, the so-called superstructure, Benoit considers the occupation of cultural terrain and the redefinition of a cultural common sense a necessary precondition for acceding to political power. For this strategic analysis, the Nouvelle Droite in France drew also on the thinkers of the New Left it opposed. This is very much a post-68 moment. Gramsci's prison notebooks are mined for tactics to achieve cultural hegemony and cultivate organic intellectuals. Louis Althusser's concept of the ideological state apparatus, a system that interpolates or hails the subject into structures of power, becomes for the new right a device in their toolkit. Tweak the apparatus, and you can use it to reprogram the process of interpolation towards the right-wing hegemony. Dominate the intellectual airspace so the thinking goes, and you can march in the political ground troops. This is a long game. Benoit likens it to the burrowing of termites or Marxist mole, that methodical animal whose tunneling prepares the ground for a new order. For Benoit, writing in the wake of 1968, the terrain to be tilled was both an ostensible leftist consensus and the democratic order itself. To this end, metapolitics takes advantage of the affordances of liberal societies, their liberties, to burrow underneath and overturn what the new right after 1968 considers a left-wing cultural hegemony. Unlike fascist propaganda in a totalitarian state, then, metapolitics as a concept depends on the openness of democratic structures, on the civil rights and freedoms of expression, of assembly, even of protest and resistance. As Benoit puts it, in this book that I'm showing here, the liberal Western regimes are by their very nature poorly protected, and indeed entirely unarmed against what he describes as metapolitical incursions into mentalities, culture, and common sense. Already during the 1970s, then, Benoit's writings on metapolitics were sounding the motif of weaponizing democracy against itself, turning liberal affordances against the very social order that guarantees them, the better to polarize an ideological, unmoored, pluralist society and gradually shift it toward an authoritarian right. Strategically developed by far-right thinkers for the past half-century, at least, the notion of metapolitics routinely crops up well beyond the French intellectual circles from which it originated, and in the spaces that it seeks to hegemonize. In writings, speeches, podcasts, memes, and videos, on internet platforms, in think tanks and publishing houses, and in the kind of education-adjacent spaces that I've come to think of as alt-right, alt-ac. And I won't get into this here today, but in Germany, you could look, my examples tend to come, although Benoit, of course, sets the tone in France, but my examples tend to come from Germany and from the US. So in Germany, there's a more or less successful, but I think important to consider a counter university called the Gegenuni, which is an online project that you can join on Telegram. Here we've got PragerU, I'll talk about that in a minute, Turning Point USA, of course, or New College after its dismantling by Ron DeSantis. In Austria, the erstwhile leader of the identitarian movement, Martin Sellner, has made metapolitics a cornerstone of his call for regime change from the right. In Germany, Götz Kubitschek and Elin Kozica have established a metapolitical command centrals of sorts in the small hamlet of Schnellroda, illustrated here on a map that a very useful project called das Netzwerk der Neuen Rechten. Here's the link. It's an interactive map that allows you to sort by think tanks, associations, I forget the various filters that you can put on, and then it shows you the interconnections between them to the degree that they were able to reconstruct them. So Schnellroda here is pretty much in the center in what was East Germany in Sachsen-Anhalt. There, the couple and people around them run a think tank, a publishing house. We can come back to any of these in the Q&A if you want. A journal. This one I'm happy to talk about in particular. A blog. Podcasts. Book clubs. Also something I'm very happy to talk about later. And a YouTube channel, as well as several social media accounts and regular seminars for the under 35, mostly male crowd. Threatened with legal action by the Office for the Protection of the Constitution for its extremist stance, the think tank recently disbanded and then reconstituted itself in separate corporate entities, rebranding its publishing arm as Metapolitics. New name, same goals, to commandeer what they call the vorpolitische Raum, the pre-political space, the cultural space that Breitbart deemed upstream from politics. Meanwhile, the AfD gratefully reaps the results downriver. Turning to the US, here too, we find white nationalists like Richard Spencer celebrating the alt-right's contribution to Trump's first presidential victory by noting that, quote, metapolitics is more important than politics. And this is the famous speech he gave upon that victory. And Steve Bannon will occasionally host guests like New Criterion editor Roger Kimball on his War Room podcast to explore Trump's attack on the institutions of culture through a Gramscian lens. And for an instructive American counterpart to the Schnellroda complex, we might look to a platform like PragerU, instructive not simply for its similar investment in building a media infrastructure for right-wing cultural influence, but also for the differences in financing, strategy, and ideological fine points that come into view in a transnational take on the new right. Despite its name, PragerU has nothing to do with an accredited university, but mimics its valuation of knowledge, learning, culture, and discourse, thereby participating actively in shaping the project originally envisioned by de Benoit and others to shift the discourse to the right. Especially in online spaces, this project draws on tropes of conversion or red pilling, as the lingo has it. I'm curious, to who knows about PragerU? Okay, too many. I'll talk about that later. As all these examples suggest, metapolitics is conducted on the terrain of the culture wars. Elia Burris has consequently suggested that we analyze it as such, thereby refocusing the narrow and distorted derivation of metapolitics from Gramsci. That said, it seems important to note that metapolitics, a term Gramsci never used, is neither coextensive with the culture wars, nor with the Gramscian notions of hegemony or the battle of position, to be joined by organic or traditional intellectuals, capital or labor, the new right or the woke left. Instead of some content-neutral politics of culture, the term metapolitics marks off one position on this terrain. So it's misleading to describe, although that's the pithy formulation with which I started, metapolitics as, politics is downstream from culture for everybody, and that's the way it works. I think it's important to note that metapolitics as a term denotes the position on this terrain which would weaponize culture for the right. Metapolitics in this sense relates to politics and culture in roughly the same way that gender ideology or genderism relates to gender, or the euphemism remigration relates to migration. Only the latter terms can serve as categories of social, historical, or cultural analysis. The former require analysis in their own right. That's what I'm saying about metapolitics. Although the term metapolitics does have a history independent of the new right, and occasionally has been advanced on the other side of the political spectrum, there's a book by Alain Badiou called Metapolitics. It is today a term of art and a reactionary political concept. As such, it signifies a strategy of cultural reconquest to restore ostensibly lost values of masculinity, authority, anti-egalitarianism, nationalism, and ethnic homogeneity. Opposed in name only to identity politics, it is deeply identitarian, ethno-nationalist, and, at least in the United States, generally white supremacist. As Alexandra Stern quips, metapolitics is white nationalist consciousness raising at the collective level. If that work is slow and methodical in many respects, it also involves a turbocharged leading edge designed to move fast and break things, as the early mantra at Facebook had it. In this vein, metapolitics leverages the affordances of social media for rapidly spreading disinformation, but it also attacks foundational structures of society and culture. If the New Left, after the 1960s, settled into the long march through the institutions, then the New Right now realizes its metapolitical ambitions in Elon Musk's rapid march through the US government and its demolition by Doge and AI. And I owe this notion of a rapid or fast march through the institutions to Matt Handelman, who has an article coming out in the next New Gym Critique about all this. A counterpart and corollary to the slow, methodical mole of metapolitics, its frantic dimension is just as central to the overall project, where it figures as accelerationism. Accelerationism is a term developed on the left, like many of these terms, as a Marxist heresy that was to point away beyond the impasse of neoliberal stasis, of the exhaustion of revolutionary energies, or of the end of history. Heighten the contradictions inherent in capitalism so the thinking went, and you hasten the advent of the revolution. Originally formulated by the philosopher Nick Land at Warwick University in the UK, the gospel of accelerationism has found a new home in Silicon Valley, where it is espoused by venture capitalists from Peter Thiel, who I hear you've been reading, or some of you, to Mark Andreessen. Pundits and podcasters like Steve Bannon, surely one of the brass-lung fundamentalist showmen of our day, have adopted this stance for the right. The gospel that Bannon spreads on his twice daily in his popular War Room podcast, recently passing the 5,000 episode mark, is action, action, action. Pray for our enemies, he exhorts his listeners, and I would play it for you if we had sound, but you got lucky we don't. Pray for our enemies, he exhorts his listeners, the War Room posse, in the title sequence of every show. Because we're going medieval on these people. The rambling monologues that follow push hard on popular discontent, financial crises, and the destructive tendencies of globalism. Rather than offer solutions, Bannon seeks to accelerate these trends through disinformation to bring liberal democracy to the breaking point. In Germany, too, secessionist Reichsbürger and prepper circles are already arming for the self-sufficiency that Day X will require. And for all the genteel intellectualism that Schnellroda exudes, the conceptual work of its think tank and publishing house is paired with a profound anti-academic and ultimately anti-intellectual gesture that privileges action over thought. The key text here is Kubitschek's Provokation, published as one of the first volumes in the Antaios Publishing House's bibliophile Kaplaken series, which just reached its 100th volume. This short treatise became an important reference point for goading the far right into action. Making good on the book's title, Kubitschek offers a manifesto of sorts, a call to arms in what he describes as a proto-Civil War moment. The text underlines the urgency of that moment with talk of time running out, verrinnende Zeit, and stark alternatives of life and death, resistance or disappearance, Gegenwehr oder Verschwinden. Given the sense of imminent revolution that Kubitschek conjures up, the casual reader of his pamphlet might easily draw parallels to manifestos across the political spectrum. But Kubitschek's colors are unmistakable in the ethno-nationalist rhetoric that undergirds his rant. His is a manifesto against immigrants, against a, quote, multicultural failure, and against egalitarianism. And it is a rallying cry for downtrodden ethnic Germans who need to mount a concerted act of resistance lest they verschwinden, or disappear. Consequently, Kubitschek exhorts his readers to join a battle for hegemony in autochthonous space. That's a horrible translation of a also terrible German phrase, which is the Kampf Vorherrschaft im eigenen Raum, which adds a latent resonance to Nazi notions of Raumordnung and Lebensraum. For anyone who cared to read this and subsequent texts, developed, I think this was, should have put the date on here. This is a decade ago, probably a little more. Developed the themes discussed at the conspiratorial meeting on a master plan for remigration reported in early 2024 by the collective collective and all but adopted at subsequent party conventions of the AfD. After all, the far right has been nothing if not consistent in peddling the conspiracy theory of a great replacement, according to which Kubitschek's autochthon space is under threat by so-called replacement immigration, Ersetzungseinwanderung, an ostensible project to overwhelm and substitute ethnic Germans with foreign immigrants. Kubitschek's provocation staked an influential position that is no accelerationist than Bannon for being moderately less brash and uncolored by connections to US venture capital, at least as far as I can tell. Impatient with the kinds of reflection, thought, deliberation, and debate that characterize liberal democracy, Kubitschek wants social and political conflict to manifest as crisis, whose advent he would hasten. Let's desire the crisis. Wünschen wir uns die Krise. Instead of more talk, Kubitschek would like to see an open declaration of war, his terms. Machen wir es kurz. Let's keep it short, concludes one of his editorials. In Deutschland tobt ein geistiger Bürgerkrieg. Lasst uns Krieg führen. In Germany, there's a spiritual war underway. Let's wage war. To ensure the plausible deniability characteristic of such right-wing calls for violence, Kubitschek is careful to specify that the civil war he has in mind is spiritual, not physical, a geistiger Bürgerkrieg. The term preserves the violent dimension of the New Right's metapolitics even as it ostensibly denies it. Accordingly, the skirmishes Kubitschek has in mind begin with the sharpening of concepts, Zuspitzung der Begriffe, and the identification of enemies, Kennzeichnung der Gegner. In other words, with metapolitics. What then do such sharpened concepts entail? How does the New Right forge its rhetorical weapons and wield its conceptual arsenal in the cultural wars? In light of its accelerationist stances, it makes sense to speak of an activist New Right, a term that captures not just Kubitschek's decisionist act and Bannon's modus operandi, but also right-wing stances in the culture wars on both sides of the Atlantic. For examples beyond Bannon and Schneerode, we need only think of other metapolitical initiatives like the stacking of school boards and challenges to ban library books in the United States, or groupings like the Identitarians or the Querdenker in Austria and Germany. This activist strand arguably aligns metapolitics more closely with socially progressive forms of political organizing than with traditional notions of conservatism. If we were to abstract from the goals of a return to traditional gender roles, racial segregation, and what the right calls the reconquest of the state, that is, if we set aside the content for a minute, metapolitics can appear formally oriented toward renewing rather than conserving the status quo. For Benoit, appropriating Gramsci was all about fomenting a cultural revolution from the right, we'll recall. Drawing inspiration from an older New Left, that is, from the social movements and the earlier cultural revolution of the 1960s, this strategy I now want to suggest is part of the larger project of scavenging among progressive causes and poaching concepts to rebrand them as right. For metapolitics borrows not just the language of revolution from the left, but with it, the politics of identity, the languages of pluralism and diversity, even anti-fascism, and more recently, the fight against anti-Semitism. These new right vocabularies routinely integrate strategies and concepts developed in the wake of 1968, even the new left's self-conception as subversive, as an often playful counterculture, as extra-parliamentary opposition, or as what Nachdenken would call Gegenöffentlichkeit, the counter-public sphere. What is striking, though, is that metapolitical organizing also borrows its contents from progressive causes. This derivative gesture has variously been described in the scholarship as a form of discursive piracy, as retortion, as mimicry, as reversal, or in Sylvia Sass's apt phrase as subversion from above, from her book Verkehrungen ins Gegenteil. But whatever you call it, the harnessing of progressive causes to right-wing ends lends itself to a confusion of political polarities. I would describe this confusion as endemic to the metapolitical project, and it has consequences for the way we think about culture and counterculture in a democracy. I'll come back to this in my conclusion. But first, let me outline by way of just a small sampling how metapolitics burrows into left-wing or progressive concepts through a form of aggressive inversion. In the process, those concepts become hollowed out and perverted as the new right turns them inside out. Take, for example, the 2023 Stolzmonat campaign, a literal German translation of Pride Month. The coordinated social media drive took direct aim at the LGBTQ plus community, which it impugned for its, quote, rainbow crap and gender madness. But it did so by appropriating and resignifying the organizing notion of queer pride, as well as the use of rainbow overlays for profile pictures during Pride Month. Only now pride, or Stolz, was to be patriotic in German, and the rainbow was replaced by the gradated colors of the German flag. Celebrated by Zellner and others as a resounding success, Stolzmonat appropriated and distorted the appeal of Pride Month for recognizing difference and diversity, and replaced it with an assertion of nationalism and tradition. More than just a way of owning the libs, as New Right parlance has it, this campaign adopted the strategies of inversion to effect an active exclusion from national belonging of those who would identify with or simply support LGBTQ plus rights. I offer straight Pride Month, as an example of what I call the identitarian reflex of a new right that decries the excesses of identity politics, but adopts identitarianism as its platform. This same reflexive gesture of inversion and aggressive resignification is at work in attacks on anti-racism for being, quote unquote, anti-white racism, a form of victim reversal that informs slogans like white lives matter, white power, or stop white genocide, say no to white genocide. Like straight pride, these coinages all depend for the provocation on the movements and values they pervert, on the history and memory of Black power, on the Black Lives Matter movement, and on the remembrance of historical genocide. Even when these phrases merely circulate as memes on the internet and social media, they exert semantic violence and impugn the cause of social justice while appropriating its language. Needless to say, this identitarian reflex goes hand in hand with the trolling and doxing of social justice warriors in the parlance of the New Right, owning the libs on campus, not to mention outright attacks and right-wing terrorism. While the broad resignification of civil rights movements is more characteristic perhaps for the US context, civil rights movements in the specific US sense of things like Black power, we can observe parallel moves in Europe where the naming of the far-right Alternative für Deutschland rewires earlier notions of a progressive alternatives. People will recall that the Greens were first known as the Alternativen. Or take the AfD's disdain for Willkommenskultur, Germany's unprecedented, if ultimately short-lived, or openness to migrants fleeing the wars in Syria and Afghanistan in 2015. While opposition to this culture of welcome is virtually the AfD's raison d'etre, the central plank of its remigration platform, the party had no problem also appropriating the term for its own ethno-nationalist ends by promoting Willkommenskultur für deutsche Kinder. For such rebranding, the AfD draws liberally on the metapolitical cues generated in Schnellroda, cues that routinely involve the same resignification we've been describing. Here, the disdain politics of difference and ethnic diversity resurface as ethno-pluralism, a seemingly innocuous term that can function as a sort of entry drug to successively more exclusionary, supremacist, and always intended notions of ethno-nationalism and the white ethno-state. A similar logic of inversion defines the new right's fraught interventions in German memory culture, or what pundits like Kubitschek and Zerna routinely refer to as the country's Schuldkult, its cult of guilt. The efforts of the AfD to minimize the role of the Holocaust in German history are by now well known. The term that always gets quoted is the bird shit on history, that the Holocaust was nothing, or Nazism was nothing but a bird poop on history. And interestingly, we forget that he didn't just say that, he said on 1,000 years of successful German history. So it's a kind of Freudian idea of how long Nazism was supposed to last. But the more perfidious tendency runs deeper and involves redefining the very notion of what it would mean for Germans to continue working through their nation's past. For the real Aufarbeitung der Vergangenheit, coming to terms with the past, Martin Zellner would have us know, would not involve confronting fascism and the Holocaust. Instead, it would mean coming to terms with the move away from ethno-cultural definitions of German identity, a move that the right calls ethno-masochism. So what we have to mourn is the fact that we're no longer homogenous. That's the real Aufarbeitung der Vergangenheit. Another volume from the Kaplaken series rehearses the victim reversal that such memory work would entail. In Die Verteidigung des eigenen, in defense of what is ours, Martin Lichtmes sets out to describe a renewed colonialism in the contemporary Western world. Except now the Germans, and by extension white Europeans and Anglo-Americans, appear not as colonizers, but as victims of colonization themselves. Lichtmes seems aware of how implausible this reversal will sound to some, but he doubles down, insisting that beginning in 1945, the German, der Deutsche, has become, quote, something like the N-word of Europe after 1945. With this aggressive resignification, Lichtmes also buttresses the popular right-wing trope of Germany's, quote-unquote, forced democratization by the Allies after World War II. Drawing on an admittedly sloppy reading of Frantz Fanon, the preeminent critic of colonialism, Lichtmes implicitly ties Germany's pre-colonial identity, its true national self, to the moment prior to its subjugation from outside through American re-education, that is, to Germany before 1945. But Lichtmes is far from finished, going on to claim that colonial subjection now characterizes all white peoples, whom it saddles with white guilt, the term is in English in the original, a guilt that portends an auto-genocidal crisis of the whole Western world. This is again the language of the Great Replacement, conspiracy theory, occasionally cloaked in the above-mentioned hyperbole of white genocide. It manages to conflate racist and Holocaust imagery, to which Lichtmes adds an anti-Semitic twist by blaming white people's ongoing colonial bondage on the global dominance of Goldman Sachs. The trope of the rootless wandering Jew becomes the paradigm for the, quote, dislocation of the self. Another, the term in German is again pulled kind of from the fabric of some archaicism. It's Entortung des eigenen is the German term. And Germany becomes a, quote, madhouse of depressive colonials and sleepwalkers who don't even recognize their own enslavement. From there, it's only one step to the opposite trope, the self-identification of Germans as the Jews of Europe, and the lament that anti-Germanism has become the new anti-Semitism. So much for the sharpening of concepts advocated by Kubitschek. We've arrived in a conceptual hall of mirrors in which everything is also its opposite, where colonizers are colonized, perpetrators are victims, democracy is dictatorship. Infatuated with Orwell, Metapolitics generates its own Orwellian mindscapes, making it difficult to discern logic from counterlogic, perception from projection, and fact from fiction. In the conceptual funhouse of Metapolitics, oppositions collapse. But to be clear, I'm not speaking of left-right equivalences here, which would be false equivalences at best. The mirror effects of Metapolitics, after all, are generated not by simple reflection, but by distortion. And the mirror funhouse only affords what Siegfried Kakawa called the tumult of propaganda, where, quote, down is up and up is down. Writing in 1937 about the ideological effects of totalitarianism, Krakauer notes that propagandists, quote, totally turn truth on its head by blaming the opponent for just those actions and machinations that they themselves are pursuing. Hannah Arendt would sound similar motifs in her work on totalitarianism and on truth and lying in politics over the following decades, and more recently, both authors' findings resonate in Naomi Klein's aptly titled Doppelganger, setting out to explore the strange equivocations by which she routinely becomes confused with other Naomi, the MAGA adherent Naomi Wolf. Klein delves into a MAGA mirror world to discover that, quote, on either side of the reflective glass, we're not having disagreements about differing interpretations of reality. We're having disagreements about who is in reality and who's in a simulation. Quote. The resulting disorientation, I submit, is strategic and central to what Martin Jay has called the dialectics of counter-enlightenment. Drawing on the languages of emancipation, of Kant's emergence from our self-imposed immaturity, of common sense and the common good, of oppression and empowerment, metapolitics constructs its reflective surfaces from scraps of Enlightenment discourse and claims democracy on its side. As Klein writes, the horror of the society that flips fascist from within, without the aid of foreign invasion, lies precisely in the unsettling sense of familiarity. For all its suggestiveness and explanatory power, however, the metaphorical arsenal of mirrors and simulations occludes one important ingredient: the subjectivity and agency of those who populate the mirror maze. In that space, it seems to me, metapolitics ultimately operates on the logic not simply of reflection, however distorted, but also of projection. Viewed in this light, the reversals of colonizer and colonized, democracy and authoritarianism, oppressor and victim, originate not on the left from where metapolitics borrows its language and derives its concepts, but from the authoritarian fantasies and white supremacist leanings on the new right itself. The latter claims to speak in the name of an allegedly silenced, ostracized, and victimized position that needs to heroically defend itself against the reigning left-wing orthodoxy. But if we look at how that orthodoxy is constructed in the writings of the new right, it turns out to be a massive projection of authoritarian and identitarian leanings. Describing the ostensible left liberal consensus as a form of soft totalitarianism, the right blurts out its desire to replace democracy with just that. And its disdain for postmodern identity politics betrays its own dream of white supremacy. Such dreams and projections have a history, or rather multiple histories. To historicize and theorize the phenomena we've been tracking, critics have reached back to early 20th century eugenics and immigration restriction in the United States. I'm thinking here of Alex Stern's excellent book, Proud Boys in the White Ethno-State. Or, especially in the German case, to the conservative revolution and its politics of cultural despair. And here I'm thinking of the work of Volker Weiss. And of course, pundits and scholars alike have been directing our attention to the history of fascism in Europe since well before the first election of Donald Trump. And here you can think of your own list. Mine includes Timothy Snyder, Jason Stanley, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, and others. As the Weimar Republic centennial rolls through our current decade, there's been good reason to be sure to look to Germany for lessons about the death spirals of democracy. But to historicize right-wing metapolitics and to theorize its projective logics in a transatlantic perspective may require a more transnational perspective on fascism itself. And so I want to return our attention to the moment with which I began. James Rorty's 1945 warning about American Führers was not a hypothetical exercise in applying the lessons of faraway fascism to American democracy, but a wake-up call, asking readers to consider the degree to which the brass-lunged fundamentalist showman had already made inroads in the United States. In the rearview mirror of metapolitics, I'd argue, their lunatic fringe politics appear newly relevant as part of a prehistory of our present. In addition to Rorty's rogues gallery of radio proselytizers, think of the rallies and activities of the German-American Bund, the terrorism of the seditious silver shirts, but also the propagandizing by German cultural organizations, Aryan bookstores, or Charles Lindbergh's speeches on behalf of the isolationist America First movement. Although some of these organizations, which one might anachronistically describe now as metapolitical, did not survive the end of World War II, On the other side of the 1945 threshold, we find McCarthy redeploying much the same playbook and subsequent conservative media activists taking up the baton from the deplatformed Cochrans and MLK Smiths. From that liminal moment around 1945, before and after, media and cultural historians are now able to trace genealogies that reach well into our present. But these developments also captured the attention of contemporary cultural critics and theorists whose insights into the metapolitics of their moment should inform our own. And this is my second reason for returning us to Rorty's article. In his call for a systematic study of would-be American Führers, Rorty draws on data collected by the Institute for Social Research at Columbia University for a series of studies then still in progress. Today, we know them as the Studies in Prejudice, conducted jointly by the Frankfurt School in Exile and the American Jewish Committee, itself a transnational theoretical conjuncture if ever there was one. These writings, I finally want to suggest, offer a theoretical compendium to what we've been calling metapolitics here and what they labeled agitation at the time. Thus, in 1949, Leo Löwenthal and Norbert Gutermann would draw the portrait of the American agitator in Prophets of Deceit, and several years earlier, Theodor Adorno had already studied the psychological techniques of one such radio personality named Martin Luther Thomas, himself completely forgotten today. Although that 1943 study remained unpublished during his lifetime, it was known to his fellow members at the Institute and provided an empirical data point that Adorno brought to the authoritarian personality. That massive undertaking was admittedly concerned less with the production of propaganda than with the fertile ground that the agitators' harangues found in the quote-unquote potentially fascist personality, which is the object of study of the authoritarian personality, the key focus and worry of the volume's contributors. Across these publications, the Institute sought to study prejudice as a socio-psychological force that ramified through the structures of capitalism and liberal democracy and was susceptible to demagogic capture. In this sense, the critical theorists look both ways, at the production of authoritarian propaganda by fascist agitators and at the fertile ground on which it could thrive. This allowed them to recognize early on the patterns of projection that I described as key to metapolitics. Indeed, that description is indebted to Adorno's and Horkheimer's analysis of anti-Semitism in the final fragments of Dialectic of Enlightenment. Drawing on Freud, for whom projection and paranoia were intimately connected, Horkheimer and Adorno trace anti-Semitism to, quote, the transference of socially tabooed impulses from the subject to the object. Through a form of abreaction, the subject legitimates hatred for the outside world, whose ostensible malign intentions are so many projections of the subject's own inner impulses. As Adorno put it in his study on Martin Luther Thomas, quote, fascist and anti-Semitic propagandists blame their victims in an almost compulsory way for exactly the things which they themselves are doing or hope to do. The same analysis subsequently informs Löwenthal and Gutermann's analysis of agitation and Prophets of Deceit, where they argue that fascist fantasies of violence often find their clearest expression where they are projected onto the other. And here I'm ventriloquizing a ventriloquy that they put at the beginning of the volume. So at the beginning of the volume, they compose from speech fragments from various agitators a kind of a source code that they will then analyze. And in that opening part, they quote the historical agitator as saying, remember at all times that the tactics employed by the usurpers of Christian liberties will be to create horror and panic by exhibitions of maximum brutalities. And the anti-Semitic projection of the agitators' own violent urges climaxes just a few lines later in the claim that Hitler and Hitlerism are the creatures of Jewry and Judaism. So they find that in the literature in the early 40s, in the speeches on the radio, and then make this text, and that's what the material they analyze. Although the content of the conspiracy theories may have shifted over time, though the anti-Semitism seems to remain constant, their structure has not. Accordingly, as Jay and Andreas Hüssen have both argued, the same logic of projection and abreaction informs the trope of cultural Marxism in particular, with the added twist that the scapegoated other onto which that particular conspiracy theory projects is none other than the Frankfurt School itself, a circular logic that Matthew Handelman describes by invoking that school's own concept of mimesis in the article that's coming out. But the logic of mimesis and projection also circulates independently of those who theorized it so persuasively, informing MAGA's translation of metapolitics into policy. Thus, when the Department of Education, in a Dear Colleague letter of February 14th, 2025, accuses DEI initiatives of, quote, pervasive and repugnant racism to rationalize its own perpetration of racial inequities through colorblind procedures, it is difficult to avoid reading this as anything other than the projection of barely tabooed white supremacist longings onto the achievements of the very Civil Rights Act they invoke. In view of these echoes across the decades, it's tempting then to read the critical theorist studies from the 1940s as manuals of sorts for decoding the agitational material of the new right's metapolitics today. Agitational material is, of course, their term. Contemporary scholars invariably note in their forewords and afterwards to several new editions of these texts how relevant they feel, in large part because they succinctly outline agitational themes, demagogic devices, and psychological techniques that we see the right wing using again today. Readers of Prophets of Deceit, for example, will readily recognize an early version of Steve Bannon's brand of accelerationism in Löwenthal's description of the agitator as, quote, the enemy of all established values, the spokesman of the apocalypse, and the carrier of disaffection. That's a pretty good description of Bannon in my book. Similarly, the principal purveyors of metapolitics on both sides of the Atlantic, whether Breitbart or Bannon, Kubitschek or Zerna, appear as so many reincarnations of the agitator as great little man, a figure that Löwenthal and Guterman describe as both almost indistinguishable from the great mass of American citizens and yet clearly one of the endogamic elite. Another really good description of Bannon, who I've spent too many hours listening to, who constantly negotiates that divide between I'm one of you, the people have had a belly full is also part of his opening montage for the show every day, and who will then remind you when it's necessary that he went to Harvard and has a degree from there. So it's always both and. Returning to the Frankfurt School's writings, in other words, brings into view a genealogy of brass-lung fundamentalist showmen that leads from the prophets of deceit to the metapolitics of the new right. But even as such resonances illuminate our present and allow us to historicize the metapolitical project, they also risk locking us into ahistorical feedback loops of retroactive prophecy, according to which Father Coughlin begets Steve Bannon, and the Weimar Republic's ostensibly inevitable devolution into fascism predicts our own. Without in any way wishing to diminish the relevance of these prehistories, then, let me suggest in conclusion that the contribution of critical theory to our understanding of metapolitics lies not on the plane of repetition or analogy, but of theory itself, more specifically in the Frankfurt School's dialectical conception of democracy and authoritarianism. Scholarship on the Frankfurt School has long noted that its first generation, at least, failed to formulate a coherent concept or theory of democracy, a surprising lacuna in light of critical theory's underlying commitments, as well as the active contributions of leading figures such as Adorno to rekindling a democratic public sphere in post-war Germany through teaching, research, and regular radio addresses. Those contributions were clearly honed by Adorno's experiences in the United States, including the studies in prejudice. Dialed into fascist agitation and authoritarian threats, the Institute's propaganda analyses of the 1940s are surprisingly explicit about the question of democracy, offering both normative and dialectical definitions. Thus, while they uphold a definition of democracy as a, quote, system that guarantees minority rights, a normative definition if ever there was one, they view the agitators' countervailing insistence on the unfettered privilege of the majority as both the lie and the truth about democracy. False, because it disavows the aspirational content of democracy, but true in that it expresses tendencies inherent in liberal democratic societies, those same tendencies that de Benoit would have the new right exploit. It is this dialectic that the agitator exploits by applying what Adorno designates as the democratic cloak trick. Dressing themselves in the garb of democracy, the fascist agitators blame progressive democratic institutions, whether the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s or diversity initiatives today, for, quote, being that very dictatorship at which the fascist aims. Like the democratic cloak trick itself, this charge forms an integral part of the New Right's metapolitical arsenal, as I hope to have shown, where the rebranding of democracy as dictatorship follows the pattern of victim reversal we saw at work in Lichtmesse's inversion of colonial logics, a pattern that informs PragerU videos teaching viewers that the anti-racist woke left is systematically racist, that was a quote, a pattern that the right fashions into slogans like white lives matter. But to unblur the concepts that metapolitics has blurred involves also refusing false equivalencies and reframing the debate. Here again, the critical theorist's historical interventions provide an important conceptual foothold for our own present. To be sure, there's something quaintly naive to their Enlightenment hope of inoculating us against fascist agitation by identifying and publicizing the agitators' recurrent tricks. Adorno calls it, says we must drastically name these tricks, and feels that that's an important contribution, which I agree with, because I think such an unmasking remains a vital aspect for any critique of right-wing metapolitics, to which I'm hoping to contribute in a small way with my own work. But Adorno, Löwenthal, Marcuse, and others always also pose the question at the more fundamental level of authoritarianism as a threat to democracy. What sets their analyses apart in this regard is again their insistence on the dialectical relation between these two terms, making authoritarianism not an external threat, but a dimension integral to any theory of democracy. If the antithesis between dictatorship and democracy had long been the structuring ideology of American culture, politics, and society, then the aftermath of fascist rule in Europe allowed their inherent entwinement to emerge more visibly than before. That recognition colors the publication history of Prophets of Deceit. As Horkheimer wrote in his introduction in 1949, quote, demagogy makes its appearance whenever a democratic society is threatened with internal destruction. And when Herbert Marcuse introduced a new edition of the book 20 years later, he noted that the analysis still held, but that the ideological work analyzed in the original had moved from the margins to the center, culminating in what he describes as, quote, the introjection of the agitator into the legitimate political machine, to the inside. Speaking to students in Vienna a couple of years earlier, Adorno found a compelling somatic image for this introjection. Fascist movements, he told them, are the wounds, the scars of a democracy that, to this day, has not yet lived up to its own concept. I take the right-wing metapolitical project that I've sketched here to be part of that growing scar tissue, a palpable and urgent reminder of the constant work that democracy requires from us if it is ever to live up to its concept. Thank you.